I don't know where you're listening from. Maybe you're working a second job to pay the bills, or preparing a meal for someone who never says thank you, or simply hoping that someone, anyone, will truly see you today. It doesn't matter what time it is or how heavy your heart feels right now. I promise, today's story will reach deep inside you, into those quiet places where love and vulnerability live. This is the story of a millionaire who showed himself vulnerable, and of a waitress who held him without thinking. The story of a confession in a humble kitchen that made her fall in love unintentionally. But more than that, it's the story of how society can turn invisible women into targets, how cruel whispers can shatter the most beautiful connections, and how sometimes the greatest act of love is letting someone go, even when it breaks your heart into 1,000 pieces. Her name was Mia Elena Rodriguez, and she had been invisible for so long that she had almost forgotten what it felt like to be truly seen. At 43, she moved through the narrow aisles of Murphy's Corner Diner on Chicago's North Side, with the practiced grace of someone who had learned to anticipate needs before they were spoken. The morning light filtering through the cracked windows caught the silver threads in her dark hair, pulled back in a simple bun secured with a pen she'd borrowed and never returned. The diner smelled of bacon, grease, and hope, that particular aroma of working-class dreams mixed with the bitter truth of endless shifts. Mia's hands, calloused but gentle, knew every inch of this place. The coffee machine that wheezed on cold mornings, the booth in the corner where the vinyl had been patched 3 times with electrical tape, the way the floor tiles buckled near the kitchen door where years of hurried steps had worn the foundation thin. She had worked here for 8 years, ever since the divorce papers were signed, and her ex-husband took everything except her dignity. The settlement that was supposed to last 2 years had evaporated in 8 months when medical bills for her mother's cancer treatment consumed every dollar. Now, at 6:15 each morning, she tied her apron strings and prepared to serve coffee to people who barely registered her existence. But Mia possessed something rare in this harsh world, a quiet strength forged in the furnace of loss. She remembered names, asked about grandchildren, and always kept an extra slice of pie for the construction worker who came in every Thursday, still grieving his wife who'd passed the previous spring. Her smile wasn't the practiced customer service expression so many wore like armor. It was genuine warmth, offered freely even when her own heart felt empty. The morning of October 15th began like any other, with the pre-dawn darkness of Chicago autumn pressing against the windows and the familiar ritual of brewing the first pot of coffee. Mia's reflection in the chrome coffee dispenser looked tired, the kind of bone-deep exhaustion that sleep couldn't cure. She'd been working double shifts for 2 months, saving every penny for her daughter Sophia's college application fees. The girl was brilliant. Bound for Northwestern or maybe even Harvard if the financial aid came through, and Mia would die before she let lack of money dim that bright future. The bell above the door chimed at exactly 6:47, and she looked up to see a man she didn't recognize. Everything about him whispered wealth, the charcoal gray Tom Ford coat that probably cost more than she made in 3 months, shoes so polished they reflected the fluorescent lights, a watch that caught the morning sun like captured starlight. But it was his eyes that made her pause mid-step. They held a kind of devastation she recognized, the look of someone who had everything except what mattered most. James Donovan was worth $800 million on paper, with holdings in real estate developments across the Midwest and a portfolio of tech stocks that had made him wealthy beyond imagination. His penthouse overlooked Lake Michigan, 40 floors above the world where normal people worried about mortgage payments and grocery bills. But that morning, sitting in the cracked vinyl booth of Murphy's Corner Diner, he felt poorer than he'd ever been in his life. The previous night, his daughter Emma had called from her apartment in Boston. Not to check on him, not to share good news, but to inform him, with the cold efficiency of a business transaction, that she was engaged to someone he'd never met and didn't want him walking her down the aisle. "You were never really there anyway," she'd said, her voice carrying the weight of 30 years of missed recitals, forgotten birthdays, and conversations cut short by urgent business calls. His son, Michael, had stopped returning his calls entirely, too busy building his own life to include the father who'd been a stranger wearing expensive suits. Mia approached his table with the coffee pot, her movements measured and graceful despite her fatigue. "Good morning," she said, her voice carrying the soft cadence of someone who'd grown up speaking Spanish first. "Coffee?" He nodded, watching as she filled the heavy white mug with hands that moved like a dancer's, economical, precise, beautiful in their simplicity. She was about to step away when something made her pause. Maybe it was the way his shoulders curved inward, or how he held the cup like it was the only warm thing in his world. Instead of returning to her other customers, she lingered. "First time here?" she asked, not from nosiness but from genuine care. In 8 years, she'd developed an intuition for people who were drowning in plain sight. James looked up at her then, really looked, and felt something crack open in his chest. When had someone last asked him a question that wasn't about money or schedules or quarterly projections? "Yes," he said simply. "I was driving and saw the light in the window. It looked," he searched for the word, "warm." Mia smiled, and in that moment, something invisible passed between them. She saw past the expensive clothes to the hollow loneliness beneath, and he saw past her uniform to the strength that kept her standing when life tried to knock her down. "Food's good here," she said quietly. "Nothing fancy, but it's made with care." "The pancakes are my favorite. They remind me of what my grandmother used to make on Sunday mornings." He ordered the pancakes, though he hadn't eaten breakfast in a restaurant in 20 years. Usually, his meals were protein shakes consumed during conference calls or catered affairs where the food was secondary to the networking. But there was something about this place, about her, that made him want to slow down, to remember what it felt like to taste something made by hands that cared about more than efficiency. As the morning progressed, the diner filled with its usual rhythm. Mia moved between tables like a conductor orchestrating a symphony of small kindnesses, extra cream for the elderly man with arthritis who couldn't grip the small containers, a gentle joke to brighten the mood of the single mother juggling 3 kids before school. A patient ear for the retired teacher who came in every day because talking to Mia was sometimes the only conversation she had. James watched it all, mesmerized by the grace with which she navigated what he realized was a complex social ecosystem. In his world, interactions were transactions, relationships were strategic alliances, and kindness was a weakness that competitors exploited. But here, he witnessed something he'd forgotten existed, genuine human connection offered without expectation of return. When she brought his pancakes, stacked high and steaming, with butter melting into golden pools and real maple syrup warming in a small pitcher, he found himself saying words he'd never spoken to a stranger. "My children don't want me in their lives." The confession escaped before he could stop it, landing between them like a raw, exposed nerve. Mia set the plate down gently and looked into his eyes with a compassion that made his throat tighten. "That must hurt terribly," she said simply, not offering empty platitudes or quick fixes, just acknowledgement of his pain. Sometimes the people we love most are the hardest to reach, especially when we've built walls so high we forget how to climb them ourselves. Her words hit him with the force of recognition. In that moment, surrounded by the comfortable chaos of morning rush, the clatter of dishes, the hiss of the coffee machine, the low murmur of conversations, James Donovan felt more understood than he had in years of boardroom meetings and charity galas, where people hung on his every word because of his net worth, not because they cared about his heart. Without thinking, driven by an impulse deeper than logic, Mia reached across the table and briefly covered his hand with hers. The touch lasted only seconds, but it carried the weight of absolute acceptance. No judgment for his failures, no interest in his fortune, just one human being offering comfort to another in pain. In that small diner kitchen corner, where sunlight struggled through unwashed windows and the scent of bacon mixed with industrial coffee, something shifted in both their worlds. James felt the armor he'd worn for decades, cracked just enough to let in a sliver of hope. Mia, for the first time in years, felt seen, not as a waitress or a divorce statistic or a woman past her prime, but as someone whose wisdom and kindness mattered. The moment stretched between them, fragile and perfect, while Chicago awakened outside and life continued its relentless march. Neither of them knew that this simple exchange of vulnerability and grace would set in motion a chain of events that would challenge everything they thought they knew about love, class, and the courage it takes to be truly human in a world that often rewards everything else. From that morning forward, James found reasons to return to Murphy's Corner Diner. Not the obvious reasons a billionaire might seek out a modest neighborhood restaurant, but because he craved something money couldn't buy, the feeling of being known by someone who had no agenda except kindness. He started coming in at 6:30 before the morning rush, when Mia had time for conversations that began with coffee orders and evolved into something deeper. She learned that his wealth had come at a price, that each million added to his portfolio had subtracted something from his humanity. He'd missed his son's first steps because of a merger in Frankfurt, forgotten his daughter's graduation because of an emergency board meeting, and somewhere along the way, he'd become a stranger in his own life. His ex-wife, Margaret, lived in their old home in Winnetka with her new husband, a literature professor who made $40,000 a year, but who, according to his children, knew how to be present in the small moments that built a life. She shared her own stories too, hesitantly at first, then with growing trust. The divorce that had left her financially devastated but emotionally free. The daughter who was her pride and joy, working 2 jobs while maintaining a perfect GPA because she'd inherited both her mother's work ethic and her dreams of something bigger. The way loneliness felt different at 43 than it had at 23, less desperate, but somehow more profound, like settling into an old sweater that fit perfectly, but carried the chill of too many solitary winters. Their connection deepened over shared references to old movies. She loved the classic Hollywood films her grandmother had introduced her to, while he found himself remembering how his mother used to watch Casablanca every Christmas Eve before the money and success consumed his family's simple traditions. They discovered a mutual appreciation for books, though his reading had devolved into business publications while hers remained rooted in novels that explored the complexity of human hearts. 3 weeks into this unexpected friendship, James made a decision that surprised even him. Instead of his usual protein shake breakfast, he started ordering real meals, the kind of comfort food his private chef in the penthouse would have been horrified to prepare. Mia began to anticipate his needs. Coffee black, no sugar, pancakes with extra butter on Wednesdays when he looked particularly worn down by whatever battles he'd fought in his glass tower the day before. The other regular customers noticed, though they were too polite or too focused on their own morning routines to comment directly. Mrs. Chen, who came in for tea and toast every day since her husband died, observed how Mia's step seemed lighter, how her smile carried a warmth that hadn't been there before. Danny, the night shift factory worker who stopped by for coffee before heading home, mentioned to his wife that the sad rich guy who'd started coming in seemed to be talking more, laughing even, which was something you didn't see much in their corner of the world. But it was Carlos, the short-order cook who'd worked alongside Mia for 6 years, who saw the danger first. He'd grown up in neighborhoods where crossing invisible class lines could bring trouble, where mixing with people above your station was viewed with suspicion by those above and below. At 58, with graying temples and hands scarred from years of handling hot grills and sharp knives, Carlos had developed a protective instinct toward Mia, who reminded him of his younger sister. "Mia," he said one afternoon as they cleaned up after the lunch rush, "that man with the expensive watch, you need to be careful." Mia paused in wiping down the counter, cloth suspended mid-motion. "He's a customer, Carlos. A lonely customer who's dealing with family problems. There's nothing to be careful about." "Men like that," Carlos continued, his voice gentle but insistent, "they live in a different world. They play by different rules. And when their worlds get complicated, people like us," he gestured around the modest diner, We're the ones who get hurt. She wanted to defend James, to explain that he wasn't like the stereotypes Carlos was conjuring. But even as the words formed in her mind, she felt a familiar flutter of uncertainty. What did she really know about him beyond the pain in his eyes and the way he listened when she talked about Sophia's dreams of studying international relations? He'd never mentioned his last name, never offered details about his business, never suggested their conversations extend beyond the safe boundaries of Murphy's Corner Diner. That evening, as she rode the L train home to her small apartment in Pilsen, Mia found herself studying her reflection in the dark window. At 43, she was still attractive, not stunning, not the type to stop traffic, but the kind of woman who grew more beautiful when you got to know her. Her eyes held depth earned through experience. Her laugh lines spoke of resilience, and her hands, though work-worn, possessed a grace that came from years of caring for others. But would she seem that way to a man who could afford anything, anyone? In her more honest moments, she wondered if she was a novelty to him, a temporary fascination with authenticity before he returned to his real life of charity, galas and business dinners with women who shared his background, his education, his understanding of how power moved through the world. Meanwhile, 30 floors above the lake, James stood at his floor-to-ceiling windows, a glass of 25-year-old scotch growing warm in his hand. The city spread out below him like a jeweled carpet, millions of lights representing lives he'd never touch, dreams he'd never understand, struggles that his wealth had insulated him from for so long that poverty and working-class life had become abstract concepts rather than daily realities. His reflection in the window showed a man who looked younger than his 51 years, thanks to good genetics, expensive skin care, and personal trainers who came to his private gym. But lately, he'd been seeing something else in the mirror, a spark of life that had been missing for so long he'd forgotten what hope felt like. It had started 3 weeks ago, in a diner that served coffee in heavy white mugs and made pancakes that tasted like childhood memories he'd buried under decades of ambition. Mia had become the brightest part of his days, and that realization both thrilled and terrified him. She didn't laugh at his jokes because he held financial power over her future. She didn't agree with his opinions because she wanted something from him. When she smiled, it reached her eyes. When she listened, it was with complete attention. When she gently teased him about putting too much syrup on his pancakes, it was with an affection he hadn't experienced since before his mother died, when love had been simple and uncomplicated by spreadsheets and stock portfolios. He'd started having his assistant research the diner, then stopped himself, recognizing the impulse as invasive and unnecessary. Whatever was growing between them should exist on its own terms, in that space where they met as equals, two people sharing coffee and conversation, their outer circumstances temporarily irrelevant. But the outside world has a way of intruding on even the most carefully protected moments, and Chicago's elite social circles were smaller than most people realized. It was inevitable that someone who knew James Donovan the billionaire would eventually witness James, the man sitting in a neighborhood diner, engaged in quiet conversation with a woman whose presence had transformed his understanding of what connection could feel like. That someone was Victoria Ashford, heir to a pharmaceutical fortune and the kind of woman who collected gossip like other people collected art. She'd been slumming it with her personal trainer, Pietro, who'd insisted on stopping for authentic Mexican food in a neighborhood she usually avoided when she spotted James through the diner's front window. At first, she thought her eyes were deceiving her. What possible reason could James Donovan have for being in such a place? But as she watched, she saw him lean forward, completely absorbed in conversation with a Hispanic woman wearing a waitress uniform. Victoria's well-trained eye cataloged details: the woman's age, her obvious working-class status, the intimate way she and James seemed to be connecting. Even more intriguing was the expression on James's face, open, vulnerable, almost boyishly eager, as he listened to whatever the waitress was saying. Victoria pulled out her phone and discreetly captured several photos, her mind already spinning the implications. James Donovan, one of Chicago's most eligible bachelors since his divorce, romantically involved with a diner waitress? The story had all the elements society columnists dreamed of: wealth, class transgression, and the delicious possibility of scandal. She didn't act immediately. Victoria was too sophisticated to rush into gossip without proper strategy. Instead, she did what wealthy women of her generation had been trained to do. She made careful inquiries, verified details, and constructed a narrative that would maximize impact while maintaining plausible deniability about her own involvement in spreading it. Within a week, she'd learned that the woman's name was Mia Rodriguez, that she was divorced with a college-aged daughter, and that she'd been working at Murphy's Corner Diner for nearly 8 years. More importantly, she discovered that James had been visiting the diner regularly for over a month, always sitting at the same booth, always served by the same waitress, always staying longer than any reasonable breakfast meeting would require. The trap was set with the carefully planned precision that women like Victoria had perfected over generations of social warfare. It began with a casual mention at the Chicago Athletic Association, where James maintained a membership he rarely used. "I saw the most interesting thing the other day," Victoria mentioned to Margaret Cromwell, whose husband owned 3 newspapers and whose tongue was sharper than her diamond tennis bracelet. James Donovan was having what looked like quite an intimate breakfast with a woman I didn't recognize, somewhere on the north side, in one of those little ethnic places. She was... Victoria paused for effect, letting the women lean closer. Working there, as a waitress. Margaret's eyes lit up with the predatory gleam of someone who'd found fresh meat for the social media wolves. How fascinating. Our James, slumming with the service industry. Do we think it's charity work or something more interesting? "Oh, definitely more interesting," Victoria replied, her voice dripping with false concern. The body language was quite familiar. "I do hope he's being careful. You know how these situations can become complicated when there are such obvious differences in," she gestured vaguely, "backgrounds." The conversation continued for another 10 minutes, each woman adding her own observations and theories, building a narrative that painted James as either a naive rich man being taken advantage of or a predatory billionaire exploiting a vulnerable working-class woman. Either version served the purpose to create scandal where none had existed and to remind everyone that crossing class lines was dangerous territory that would be monitored and punished by those who had the most to lose if such boundaries became permeable. Within 48 hours, the whispers had spread through every country club, charity board, and private dinner party where Chicago's elite gathered. The story grew and changed with each retelling. Mia became younger or older, more or less attractive, more or less calculating, depending on the prejudices of whoever was doing the telling. James became either a victim or a villain, but in every version he was diminished, his judgment questioned, his character examined and found wanting. The first direct consequence came through his business relationships. Jonathan Wesley, the chairman of First Midwest Development Bank, called to schedule an urgent lunch meeting. They'd known each other for 15 years, had done deals worth hundreds of millions together, had played golf at exclusive courses, and attended each other's social functions with the easy familiarity of men who understood both business and pleasure. "James," Jonathan said over perfectly prepared salmon at the Chicago Club, "I'm going to speak to you as a friend. There are rumors circulating that concern me, not just personally, but professionally. You know how conservative our investors are, how important reputation management is in our industry." James set down his fork carefully, his appetite suddenly gone. "What kind of rumors?" "The kind that suggest you're involved with someone whose circumstances might reflect poorly on your judgment. Our clients trust us with their generational wealth, James. They need to believe that our leadership makes sound decisions in all areas of life." The conversation continued for another 20 minutes, Jonathan's language growing more direct as he outlined the potential consequences. Board positions that might be reconsidered, invitations that might not be extended, investment partnerships that could be quietly dissolved, all presented with the gentle concern of a friend, but carrying the unmistakable threat of professional and social excommunication if James didn't distance himself from whatever inappropriate relationship he had developed. By the time James left the restaurant, his hands were shaking with a combination of rage and fear. In a single conversation, his entire world had revealed its true nature, conditional, transactional, and brutal to anyone who stepped outside the carefully maintained boundaries of acceptable behavior. The friendship and trust he'd thought he'd built over decades proved to be as fragile as spun sugar, dissolving the moment his personal choices threatened the group's sense of propriety. That evening, instead of going to the diner, he stayed in his penthouse, pacing between his wall of windows and his collection of first-edition books that now seemed like museum pieces, beautiful, valuable, and utterly devoid of the warmth he'd found in Mia's simple stories about her grandmother's cooking and her daughter's dreams. The next morning, Mia prepared the coffee at 6:15 as usual, automatically making it black and setting aside the small pitcher of warm maple syrup. When 6:30 came and went without James's arrival, she felt a flutter of concern. By 7 o'clock, as the morning rush began in earnest, she told herself he'd probably had an early meeting or a family emergency. By noon, when her shift ended, she couldn't shake the feeling that something fundamental had shifted in her world. She wouldn't see him again for 3 days, during which she found herself glancing at the door every few minutes, listening for the distinctive chime of the bell that announced new customers. When he finally returned, everything was different. He was polite but distant, ordering quickly and avoiding the kind of lingering conversation that had become the foundation of their connection. His eyes, which had begun to carry warmth and openness, were shuttered again, protected behind walls she couldn't understand or breach. "Is everything all right?" she asked quietly, refilling his coffee cup with hands that trembled slightly. "Fine," he replied, not meeting her eyes. "Just busy with work." But nothing was fine, and they both knew it. James had made the calculation that many powerful men make when their personal desires conflict with their professional security. He chose the familiar territory of wealth and status over the uncertain path of genuine connection. What he didn't realize was that this choice would cost him far more than he could have imagined, and that Mia would pay the highest price for a relationship she'd never asked for and a connection she'd offered with the purest of intentions. The trap Victoria Ashford had so carefully set was about to spring closed, and both James and Mia were about to learn how quickly whispers could become weapons and how devastating the consequences could be when two worlds collided without permission from the gatekeepers of either. The destruction began on a Tuesday morning in November, when the first frost of the season painted delicate patterns on Murphy's Corner Diner's windows. Mia arrived at 5:30 to help with prep work, her breath visible in small clouds as she fumbled with the keys. Chicago mornings in late autumn carried a bite that reminded everyone winter was coming, and she pulled her coat tighter as she stepped into the familiar warmth of the restaurant. Carlos was already there, firing up the grill and brewing the first pot of coffee. Over 6 years of working together, they'd developed a comfortable rhythm. She handled the front of house while he managed the kitchen, their partnership built on mutual respect and shared understanding of what it meant to earn a living with your hands and your heart. "Morning, mija," he called from behind the pass-through window, but his usual cheerful greeting carried an undertone she couldn't quite identify, and when she looked at him more closely, she saw something in his expression that made her stomach tighten with apprehension. "Carlos? What's wrong?" He emerged from the kitchen, wiping his hands on his apron, and she noticed he was holding a folded newspaper. The Chicago Tribune, open to the social and business section that neither of them usually read. His weathered face carried the expression of someone about to deliver bad news to someone he cared about. "Sit down, Mia. I need to set up the tables. Sit down," he repeated, his tone gentle but insistent. "There's something you need to see." She sank into the booth by the window, the one where James had sat for the past month, and Carlos placed the newspaper in front of her. There, in the Around Town column written by Margaret Cromwell, was a small item titled "Billionaire's Breakfast Club." The words seemed to swim before her eyes as she read, "Sources report that prominent investor James Donovan has been spotted regularly at a North Side diner, apparently quite taken with one of the establishment's staff members. While charity work is admirable, one wonders if Mr. Donovan's interests are purely philanthropic. The lady in question is reportedly a divorced waitress with a college-age daughter. We're sure it's all perfectly innocent, but in these times when image matters so much in business relationships, perhaps some advisors might suggest more appropriate venues for regular dining." The item was only 4 sentences long, but each word felt like a slap. The seemingly innocent language carried barbs designed to wound, the quotation marks around philanthropic, the emphasis on divorced waitress, the suggestion that their relationship was inappropriate while maintaining plausible deniability about any direct accusations. "They don't use my name," Mia said quietly, her voice barely above a whisper. "They don't have to," Carlos replied, settling into the booth across from her. "Anyone who knows this place, knows you, knows exactly who they're talking about. And now, anyone who reads this garbage knows it too." Mia felt a strange detachment, as if she were watching someone else's life being dissected in print. She'd never asked for attention, never sought anything beyond the simple human connection she'd offered to a lonely man who needed kindness. Now that connection was being twisted into something sordid, examined through the lens of class warfare and social propriety. "I didn't do anything wrong," she said, more to herself than to Carlos. "I know that. You know that. But that doesn't matter to people who see the world as us versus them." He leaned forward, his voice carrying decades of experience with situations like this. Rich people, powerful people, they protect their own. And when someone from outside gets too close, they close ranks. As if summoned by their conversation, the bell chimed and Harold Murphy himself walked through the door. At 68, Harold had owned the diner for 23 years, inheriting it from his father and running it with the steady competence of someone who understood both food service and neighborhood dynamics. He was a fair employer, demanding but not cruel, and Mia had always respected the way he treated his staff with dignity, even when customers didn't. But this morning, his usual greeting was absent, replaced by a heavy seriousness that made her pulse quicken. "Mia, I need to see you in the office." The office was barely larger than a closet, wedged between the kitchen and the storage room, containing a desk, 2 chairs, and filing cabinets that held 8 years of receipts, employment records, and the small bureaucracy required to keep a family business running. Harold closed the door behind them and settled into his chair with the weariness of someone who'd made difficult decisions before and didn't enjoy the prospect of making another. "You saw the paper," he said. It wasn't a question. "Yes." "Phone's been ringing all morning. Reporters wanting to know about the waitress and the millionaire. Food bloggers asking if they can do a story about the diner where the rich guy comes slumming." He rubbed his face with both hands. "I've had this place for over 20 years, Mia. Never had a day of publicity, never wanted one. We serve good food to working people and tourists who stumble in. That's the business model. That's what works." She could see where this was heading, but she remained silent, letting him work through the logic that was about to destroy her livelihood. "This James Donovan. I looked him up after you mentioned he'd become a regular. Net worth north of $800 million. Owns property all over the city, sits on boards, moves in circles where a lunch costs more than most people make in a week." Harold looked at her with genuine sadness. "What did you think was going to happen, bringing that world into this one?" "I didn't bring anything anywhere," she said quietly. "He's a customer. He orders food, I serve it. We talk sometimes, that's all." "Is it? Because the way these newspaper people are telling it, there's more to the story." "Then they're lying." Harold studied her for a long moment, and she saw him weighing her 8 years of reliable service, her reputation for honesty and hard work, against the potential consequences of keeping her employed while media attention swirled around his quiet neighborhood restaurant. "Maybe they are lying," he said finally. "Maybe you really didn't do anything to encourage this situation. But it doesn't matter now. The story's out there, and it's attached to this place, to you working here. I've got 3 other employees who depend on their jobs, rent to pay, suppliers who expect to be paid on time. I can't risk all of that for what? For me. For a situation that's gotten too complicated. I'm sorry, Mia. I truly am. You're one of the best employees I've ever had, but I need you to clean out your locker and turn in your apron. The words hit her like a physical blow, stealing her breath and making the small room seem even smaller. 8 years of building relationships with regular customers, of perfecting the intricate dance of breakfast rush service, of earning respect through consistency and kindness, erased by 4 sentences in a newspaper written by someone who had never spoken to her, never tried to understand the simple truth of what had happened. When? She managed to ask. Now, I'll pay you through the end of the week, give you a good reference for anywhere else you want to work. But you can't come back here, Mia. I can't let you. She nodded, not trusting her voice, and stood to leave. At the door, she turned back, needing to say one more thing. Harold, I never wanted any of this. All I did was be kind to someone who needed kindness. That's all I've ever done here. I know, he replied, and the genuine regret in his voice almost broke her. But sometimes being kind isn't enough to protect you from how cruel people can be. 15 minutes later, she walked out of Murphy's Corner Diner for the last time, carrying her personal belongings in a paper bag and 8 years of memories that would never be the same. Carlos hugged her at the door, pressing a folded piece of paper into her hand, his personal phone number and an address where she could find him if she needed anything. The November morning felt colder as she stood on the sidewalk, looking back at the place that had been her second home, her source of income, her daily routine. Through the window, she could see the booth where she and James had shared conversations that had meant something to her, even if they had apparently meant something entirely different to the world that judged such connections from the outside. She didn't know that James had already received a call from Harold, explaining that the employee in question would no longer be working at the establishment and suggesting that Mr. Donovan might want to find a different place for his morning coffee. She didn't know that he'd hung up the phone and stared at his wall of windows for 20 minutes, understanding that his decision to distance himself had not protected either of them, but had instead made her a casualty of his cowardice. All she knew was that she had to go home to her small apartment in Pilsen and figure out how to tell her daughter Sophia that the mother who had always been able to handle anything was suddenly lost in a world that had turned hostile without warning. Punished for a crime she couldn't even clearly identify, except that she had dared to treat someone with wealth as if he were simply human. The L-train ride home felt endless, each stop marking another mile between who she'd been that morning and who she was becoming. A woman without a job, without prospects, carrying the weight of public scandal for a relationship that had existed primarily in quiet conversations and the simple exchange of coffee and kindness. By the time she climbed the stairs to her third-floor apartment, she could hear her phone buzzing with messages. Text after text from co-workers at other restaurants where she'd worked over the years, friends from her neighborhood, even her ex-husband's sister, calling to ask if the rumors were true. The story was spreading through the interconnected web of Chicago's service industry, where everyone knew someone who knew someone, and where gossip traveled faster than good news. She turned off the phone and sat at her small kitchen table, looking out at the November afternoon that had turned gray and threatening. In 6 hours, her life had transformed from modest stability to uncertain chaos, and she still didn't fully understand how kindness had become scandal, how human connection had been twisted into something that required punishment and exile. But more than anything, she wondered about James, whether he knew what had happened, whether he cared, whether the man who had seemed so grateful for simple acceptance had any idea that accepting him had cost her everything she'd worked 8 years to build. The silence in her apartment was different from the comfortable quiet of early mornings before work. This was the silence of endings, of doors closing, of a future that had suddenly become much more uncertain and frightening than anything she'd faced since her divorce. And in that silence, she began to understand the true cost of crossing lines she hadn't even known existed, lines that people with wealth and power drew around themselves to keep their world safe from the complications of treating working people as if they were fully human. She hadn't done anything wrong, but in a system designed to protect privilege above all else, innocence was not enough to save her from becoming collateral damage in a war she hadn't even known was being fought. The aftermath unfolded with the relentless precision of dominoes falling in a pattern designed by people who understood power better than mercy. Within 48 hours of the Tribune article, the story had been picked up by 3 gossip blogs, 2 radio stations, and a local television news segment that ran during the morning show when commuters were grabbing coffee and getting dressed for work. Each retelling added new details, most of them fabricated or twisted beyond recognition. Mia became alternately a gold digger who had targeted James specifically for his wealth, or a naive woman being taken advantage of by a predatory billionaire. The diner was described as everything from a seedy establishment to a working-class gem, depending on the angle the reporter wanted to take. James himself was portrayed as either a fool or a villain, but never as what he actually was, a lonely man who had found unexpected comfort in genuine human connection. The media attention drew protesters, too. On Wednesday morning, a small group of activists gathered outside Murphy's Corner Diner with signs reading, "No justice, no service," and "Protect working women." They'd gotten the story completely backward, assuming James was exploiting Mia rather than the truth, that she'd lost her job for treating him with basic human dignity. But truth was irrelevant now. The narrative had taken on a life of its own, feeding on assumptions and prejudices that had nothing to do with what had actually happened between 2 people sharing coffee and conversation. Harold Murphy stood inside his restaurant, watching the protesters through windows he'd had to cover with newspaper to block the view of customers inside. Business was down 60% since the story broke, half from people who didn't want to be associated with a scandal-ridden establishment, and half from regular customers who were intimidated by the media circus that had transformed their quiet neighborhood gathering place into a spectacle. "This is exactly what I was trying to avoid," he told his remaining staff. 23 years building a reputation, and it gets destroyed in a weekend because a rich guy couldn't find somewhere appropriate to eat his breakfast. But the real destruction was happening in Mia's life, away from cameras and protesters, in the grinding practical reality of being unemployed in a city where rent was due every month and health insurance was tied to employment. She'd applied for 17 restaurant jobs in 4 days, carrying letters of recommendation from previous employers and a resume that showed 8 years of steady employment at Murphy's. The first few rejections were polite but firm. They appreciated her experience, but they decided to go with someone else. By the 4th restaurant, the manager was more direct. "Look, I know who you are," he said, not unkindly but without room for negotiation. "I saw the news. I don't care if you did anything wrong or not. I can't hire someone who comes with that kind of attention. My customers want to eat their eggs." Benedict without wondering if they're going to end up in some tabloid story. The same logic applied everywhere she went. Restaurant owners, already operating on thin margins and dependent on steady customer bases, couldn't afford to associate their businesses with controversy. Mia's experience and work ethic were irrelevant compared to the liability she represented simply by being recognizable as the woman from the newspaper story. By Friday, she'd exhausted her contacts in the food service industry and had started applying for retail positions, cleaning jobs, anything that would provide income while she figured out a longer-term solution. But even those employers were reluctant to hire someone whose name had become associated with scandal, regardless of the circumstances. Sophia called that evening from Northwestern, where she was completing her sophomore year with a double major in international relations and economics. At 20, Mia's daughter possessed the kind of fierce intelligence and moral clarity that came from growing up with a mother who had always been honest about life's difficulties while maintaining faith that hard work and integrity would eventually be rewarded. "Mom, I saw the story online. Are you okay? Mia settled into her kitchen chair, looking out at the Chicago skyline twinkling in the distance, lights in windows representing thousands of lives that were continuing normally while hers had been turned upside down. I'm fine, baby. It's just some foolish gossip that will blow over soon. The comment section is horrible. People saying terrible things about you without knowing anything about who you are or what actually happened. Comment sections are where people go to say things they'd never say to someone's face. Don't read them, Sophia. They have nothing to do with reality. But Sophia was her mother's daughter, intelligent and perceptive enough to hear the strain in Mia's voice despite her attempts to sound unaffected. You lost your job, didn't you? There was no point in lying to someone who knew her so well. Yes, but I'll find another one. I always do. This is so unfair. All you did was be nice to someone who needed it. Since when is that a crime? Since always, Mia thought but didn't say. Since the first time someone with power decided that kindness from people without power was a threat that needed to be eliminated. Since the first time someone wealthy needed to be reminded that the people who served them were supposed to remain invisible, interchangeable, grateful, but not too familiar. Life's not fair, sweetheart, but it's still good. This will pass, and I'll be stronger for having gone through it. After they hung up, Mia sat in her small kitchen as the evening deepened into night. Her savings account held enough money to cover rent for 3 months if she was careful, 4 if she got creative with groceries and utilities. Her health insurance through the diner would continue for another 60 days, after which she'd have to navigate the complexities of individual coverage with no employment to subsidize the costs. But the financial concerns, serious as they were, weren't what kept her awake that night. It was the deeper wound of being punished for treating someone with dignity, of discovering that simple human kindness could become a weapon used against her by people she'd never met, who had decided her life was less important than their comfort with social hierarchies. Meanwhile, in his penthouse overlooking the lake, James Donovan was experiencing his own version of hell. The business consequences Jonathan Wesley had warned him about were materializing with devastating efficiency. 2 board positions had been quietly rescinded, with polite explanations about schedule conflicts and shifting priorities. A real estate deal he'd been negotiating for 18 months had suddenly stalled as investors expressed concerns about leadership stability and judgment. But worse than the professional damage was the personal cost. He'd tried calling the diner on Wednesday morning only to learn that Mia no longer worked there. Harold Murphy had been brusque but clear. She's gone and she's not coming back. You might want to think about finding a different place for breakfast. He'd attempted to find her through social media, through public records, through the subtle inquiries that wealthy people could make without seeming intrusive. But Mia had always lived a deliberately modest life, with minimal digital footprint and privacy carefully guarded. Short of hiring a private investigator, which felt like a violation of everything their friendship had represented, he had no way to reach her. The irony wasn't lost on him. He had $800 million, owned properties across 3 states, could have dinner with senators or movie stars with a single phone call. But he couldn't find the one person whose company had meant more to him than all the wealth and access he'd accumulated over decades of ruthless success. His children, who had barely spoken to him in years, called within days of the story breaking. Not out of concern for his well-being, but to express their embarrassment about having their family name associated with what Emma called some ridiculous midlife crisis played out in the tabloids. "Dad, what were you thinking?" Michael demanded during a tense phone call. "Do you have any idea how this looks? I'm trying to build my own career, and now I have to answer questions about my father's inappropriate relationship with some waitress." "There was nothing inappropriate about it," James replied, his voice tight with controlled anger. "She was a friend, a decent, intelligent woman who showed me kindness when I needed it." "Then why didn't you invite her to the house? Why didn't you introduce her to your actual friends? Why was it all secret meetings in some dive restaurant?" The questions hit their target because there was truth in them. Truth that James hadn't wanted to examine too closely while he was enjoying the simple pleasure of being accepted for who he was rather than what he owned. He hadn't introduced Mia to his social circle because he'd known instinctively that his world would destroy whatever was growing between them, would twist her natural grace into something calculated, would contaminate the purity of connection with the poison of judgment and social positioning. "Because I knew this would happen," he said finally. "Because I knew that people like you, like everyone in our circle, would reduce her to stereotypes and assumptions instead of seeing who she really is." "People like me?" Emma's voice was ice cold. "You mean people who understand that actions have consequences? That when you're a public figure, your choices affect more than just yourself?" The conversation ended badly, as they all did now. His children's concern wasn't for his happiness or emotional well-being, but for their own reputations and the family image they'd inherited along with their trust funds. The judgment in their voices was identical to the tone he'd heard from Jonathan Wesley, from Victoria Ashford's carefully crafted gossip, from everyone who believed that wealth came with the obligation to maintain clear boundaries between social classes. On Thursday night, unable to sleep, James drove to the north side and parked across the street from Murphy's Corner Diner. The building looked smaller and more vulnerable in the darkness, windows covered with newspaper, a handwritten sign taped to the door explaining that they were temporarily closed due to circumstances beyond our control. He sat in his Tesla for 20 minutes, watching the empty restaurant and thinking about all the mornings he'd spent in the booth by the window, feeling more connected to life than he had since his wife left him 3 years earlier. Mia's laughter, her stories about Sophia's achievements, her gentle wisdom about forgiveness and resilience. All of it seemed like a dream now, something that had happened to someone else in a different lifetime. The worst part was knowing that his cowardice had contributed to her destruction. When Jonathan Wesley had pressured him to distance himself from the relationship, James had complied immediately, calculating that temporary withdrawal would protect them both from social consequences. Instead, his sudden coldness had probably hurt Mia personally, while his retreat had left her exposed and alone when the media storm hit. He'd chosen his wealth and status over genuine human connection, and now he had neither. His fortune remained intact, but it felt meaningless without someone who valued him for reasons that had nothing to do with his net worth. His social position was secure, but it was populated by people whose affection was contingent on his conformity to their expectations. As he drove home through the empty streets of Chicago, past restaurants and bars where people were laughing and talking and building relationships based on mutual affection rather than mutual benefit, James understood that he'd lost more than a friend. He'd lost the chance to be the man Mia had seen in him, someone capable of vulnerability, growth, and genuine connection with another human being. The woman who had treated his pain with gentle respect was now suffering consequences for her kindness, while he remained insulated by wealth and privilege from any real accountability for his choices. It was a moral failure that would haunt him through the sleepless nights ahead, as he learned what it felt like to be truly alone with money that couldn't buy back the one thing that had made him feel alive. 3 weeks passed like a slow hemorrhage, each day bleeding away a little more of the life Mia had carefully constructed over the past 8 years. She'd managed to find temporary work with a catering company that specialized in corporate events, but the hours were unpredictable and the pay was 60% of what she'd made at the diner. More importantly, it was work that required her to remain invisible, setting up buffets in office buildings before employees arrived, cleaning up after business lunches where she wasn't allowed to make eye contact with the attendees, serving drinks at charity functions where she was expected to blend into the background like animated furniture. The anonymity that had once felt oppressive now seemed like protection. At these events, she was just another server in black pants and a white shirt, indistinguishable from dozens of other working women who moved through Chicago's corporate landscape without attracting attention or curiosity. No one looked at her closely enough to recognize her as the woman from the newspaper story, and she was grateful for that invisibility even as it reminded her of how far she'd fallen from the small dignity she'd found at Murphy's Corner Diner. But it was Sophia who was paying the highest price for her mother's moment of unwary kindness. The story had spread through social media with the ruthless efficiency of all scandal, and college students were particularly brutal in their judgment of situations they didn't understand. Someone had tracked down Sophia's Facebook profile, connected her to Mia through shared photos and posts, and suddenly the young woman found herself defending her mother to classmates who had decided that any relationship between a waitress and a billionaire must be calculated, transactional, evidence of moral failing on both sides. "They're saying you're a gold digger," Sophia told her over the phone, her voice tight with anger and hurt. "They're saying you targeted him specifically, that you researched him and planned the whole thing. Some girl in my economics class said maybe you got what you deserved for trying to climb above your station." Mia closed her eyes, sitting in her small kitchen with another rejection letter from a potential employer spread on the table in front of her. "What did you say to her?" "I said she'd never worked a day in her privileged life, never had to smile at people who treated her like she was invisible, never understood what it meant to show kindness without expecting anything in return. I said my mother had more dignity in her little finger than that girl would have in her entire spoiled existence." "Sophia, no, Mom. I'm tired of you being reasonable about this. I'm tired of you making excuses for people who are destroying your life because you dared to be human with someone they think is too important to be treated like a person." The pain in her daughter's voice was almost unbearable. Sophia had worked so hard to fit into the academic world at Northwestern, studying twice as long as her classmates because she'd attended underfunded public schools, taking out loans and working part-time jobs because they didn't qualify for the financial aid that made college easy for truly poor families, but left working-class students in an impossible middle ground. Now, her mother's scandal was threatening the reputation Sophia had worked so hard to build, marking her as someone associated with controversy and questionable judgment. In an environment where networking and social connections were as important as grades, that kind of stigma could follow her for years. "Maybe you should transfer," Mia said quietly. "Maybe a fresh start somewhere else would be better. I'm not running away, and neither should you." But Mia was already running, in small ways that accumulated daily. She avoided her usual grocery store because the teenager who worked the checkout line had looked at her with recognition and whispered to her coworker. She stopped going to the community center where she'd taken evening English classes, afraid that other students would know her story and judge her for it. She even changed the route she walked to the L station to avoid passing Murphy's Corner Diner, which had reopened but would forever remind her of the life she had lost. The isolation was becoming its own kind of prison, and she was starting to understand how scandal could destroy people not through any single catastrophic event, but through the gradual erosion of normal life, the way social disapproval could make someone smaller and smaller until they disappeared entirely. Meanwhile, the gossip had reached the highest levels of Chicago society, where it was discussed with the clinical detachment wealthy people reserved for examining the failures of those beneath them. At the annual Children's Hospital Charity Gala, held in the ballroom of the Palmer House, Victoria Ashford held court at a table that cost $50,000 to sponsor, entertaining her companions with updates on the scandal she'd helped create. "The whole thing has been quite educational," she said, her diamond earrings catching the light as she gestured with her champagne glass. "It's a perfect example of what happens when people forget their place in the natural order of things. James thought he could play house with someone from an entirely different world, and the woman thought she could somehow transcend her circumstances through association with his wealth. Both of them learned rather painful lessons about reality." Margaret Cromwell, the Tribune columnist who had written the original story, nodded in agreement. "I actually feel sorry for the daughter. Northwestern isn't cheap, and this kind of scandal can't be helping her social development. The poor girl is probably discovering that choices have consequences she never anticipated." The conversation continued for several minutes, each woman adding her own observations about class boundaries and appropriate behavior, analyzing Mia's life like entomologists examining a pinned butterfly. None of them had ever worked in food service, ever worried about rent, ever been forced to choose between dignity and survival. To them, Mia wasn't a complex human being with dreams and fears and the same capacity for love and loss as anyone else. She was a cautionary tale about the importance of maintaining social hierarchies. James wasn't present at the gala, though he'd been invited and was expected to attend. His absence was noted and interpreted as further evidence of poor judgment, another sign that his association with inappropriate people had corrupted his understanding of social obligations. In reality, he'd been driving around Chicago's South Side for 2 hours, trying to work up the courage to knock on doors and ask questions that might lead him to Mia. He'd finally hired a private investigator, hating himself for the invasion of privacy, but desperate to find her and apologize, to explain what had happened, to somehow make amends for the cowardice that had left her exposed to consequences he should have anticipated. The investigator had found an address in Pilsen, a third-floor apartment in a building whose brick facade had been painted over so many times that the original color was impossible to determine. Standing on the sidewalk across the street, looking up at windows that might or might not be hers, James realized he had no plan beyond finding her. What did you say to someone whose life you'd helped destroy through your own weakness? How did you apologize for choosing privilege over integrity, safety over courage? His phone buzzed with messages from his assistant, board members, business partners, all the people whose approval he'd prioritized over Mia's well-being. Each message was a reminder of the world he'd protected by sacrificing her, the same world that was now judging him for having been stupid enough to develop feelings for someone they considered beneath notice. The irony was bitter and complete. He'd gained nothing by distancing himself from Mia. His reputation was damaged anyway. His business relationships remained strained. His personal life was as empty as it had been before he met her. But she had lost everything: her job, her privacy, her sense of security, her daughter's peace of mind. As he stood on that windswept street in November, James understood that wealth without courage was just another form of poverty, that all his money and power meant nothing if he couldn't use them to protect the people who mattered to him. He'd spent months learning to be vulnerable with Mia, sharing his fears and loneliness, and discovering that authentic connection was possible even for someone as armored by privilege as he'd become. But when vulnerability required real risk, social disapproval, professional consequences, the judgment of people whose opinion he'd been trained to value above his own moral instincts, he'd retreated into the safety of conformity and left Mia to face the storm alone. Now, looking up at those anonymous windows, he made a decision that should have been obvious weeks earlier. He would find her, apologize completely and without expectation of forgiveness, and do whatever he could to repair the damage his cowardice had caused. Not because he hoped to restore their relationship, but because she deserved to know that someone recognized the injustice she'd suffered and was willing to take responsibility for contributing to it. It was long overdue, probably too late, and certainly insufficient to undo the harm that had been done. But it was a beginning, a first step toward becoming the man Mia had seen in him during those quiet morning conversations, someone capable of choosing courage over comfort, integrity over convenience, love over the fear of what other people might think. The December wind carried the scent of snow and the promise of a long Chicago winter. But for the first time in weeks, James felt something other than regret and self-loathing. He felt the faint stirring of hope that it might not be too late to do the right thing, even if doing it couldn't undo the wrong he'd already caused. The reunion happened on a Thursday afternoon in December, when the first real snow of the season was beginning to dust the streets, and Mia was walking home from another fruitless job interview. She'd been at a hotel near the Loop, applying for a position in housekeeping, work that paid less than waitressing, but offered the anonymity she now craved. The manager had been polite but clear. They'd found someone with more relevant experience. She was tired in ways that went beyond physical exhaustion, worn down by weeks of rejection and the constant awareness that her life had become a cautionary tale. A story told by people who'd never worked in service industries about the dangers of forgetting your place. The temporary catering work was ending soon, and her savings were almost gone, despite her careful budgeting and the small sacrifices that had become daily routine. Generic groceries, thermostats set low enough to see her breath in the morning, walking instead of taking the L whenever possible. Lost in these calculations of diminishing resources and shrinking possibilities. She didn't notice the man sitting on the steps of her apartment building until she was close enough to recognize his face. James Donovan, looking older and more uncertain than she'd ever seen him, wearing an expensive coat that couldn't disguise the weight he'd lost or the hollow appearance of someone who hadn't been sleeping well. For a moment, they simply stared at each other through the falling snow, two people whose lives had been fundamentally altered by their brief connection and the social machinery designed to punish such connections when they crossed prescribed boundaries. "Mia," he said, standing slowly as if any sudden movement might cause her to flee. "I've been looking for you." She felt a complex mix of emotions: anger at the man whose withdrawal had felt like abandonment, relief that he'd finally sought her out, fear about what his presence in her neighborhood might mean for neighbors who were already curious about her sudden unemployment, and underneath it all, the stubborn warmth she'd always felt in his presence despite everything that had happened. 3 weeks, she said quietly. "You've been looking for me for 3 weeks? Longer than that. I tried to find you the day after I heard what happened at the diner, but I didn't know where you lived, and I didn't want to intrude by hiring investigators or—" He gestured helplessly, recognizing how inadequate his explanation sounded. "But you did hire investigators." "Yes." Finally. "Because I couldn't stand not knowing if you were okay, not being able to apologize for what I did to you." She studied his face, noting the genuine remorse, but also the way he still looked prosperous, protected, insulated from the consequences that had devastated her life. "What did you do to me, James? I've been trying to figure that out for weeks." "I abandoned you. When you needed someone to stand up and tell the truth about what we were to each other, I disappeared. I let you face the consequences alone while I protected myself and my reputation." He took a step closer, and she could see her breath mingling with his in the cold air. "I was a coward, and my cowardice cost you everything you'd worked for." The simple honesty of his admission hit her harder than anger would have. She'd prepared for excuses, justifications, explanations about business pressures and social obligations. But this straightforward acknowledgement of moral failure was somehow more painful because it confirmed what she'd suspected, that he could have prevented much of what had happened to her if he'd chosen courage over convenience. "Do you want to come up?" she asked, surprising herself with the invitation. "It's cold, and I don't want my neighbors to see us having this conversation on the street." Her apartment was smaller than he'd imagined, but clean and carefully arranged to maximize the limited space. Family photos covered one wall: Sophia at various ages, Mia with her parents who still lived in Guadalajara, graduation pictures and birthday celebrations that spoke of a life rich in relationships even when it was poor in material resources. The furniture was mismatched but comfortable, and the kitchen table where they sat was scarred with years of use but polished to a soft shine. She made coffee without asking if he wanted any, needing the familiar ritual to steady her hands and her emotions. When she set the cup in front of him, he noticed it was one of the heavy white mugs from the diner, and he realized she must have taken it with her when she cleaned out her locker, a small piece of the life that had been stolen from her. "I saw the newspaper story," he said, "the one that started all this." "I figured you had. That's why you stopped coming to the diner, isn't it? Someone told you it would be bad for business if people thought you were involved with a waitress." He flinched at the accuracy of her assessment. "Jonathan Wesley. He's chairman of First Midwest Development Bank, handles a lot of my commercial loans. He said investors were concerned about my judgment, that my personal relationships were affecting my professional credibility." "And you believed him?" "I was afraid he was right. I spent 30 years building my business, creating wealth that was supposed to take care of my children and their children. When he told me that was at risk, James paused, staring into his coffee. I made the same choice I'd been making my whole life. I chose money over people. Mia sat across from him, hands wrapped around her own mug for warmth, watching this man who commanded boardrooms and owned buildings struggle to articulate the moral mathematics that had led to her destruction. She should have hated him, should have demanded that he leave and never contact her again. Instead, she felt the familiar pull of compassion that had gotten her into this situation in the first place. "What changed?" she asked. "Why are you here now?" "Because I realized that all the money in the world doesn't matter if you can't look at yourself in the mirror. Because I've spent 6 weeks hating the man I became when I let fear make my decisions for me." He looked up at her then, and she saw the same pain that had first made her reach across the table to touch his hand. "And because you deserved better from me. You deserved better from all of us." They talked for 2 hours as the winter afternoon faded into evening, and the snow continued to fall outside her small windows. James told her about the business consequences he'd feared, most of which had materialized anyway once the story became public. He described his children's embarrassment and anger, their judgment of his poor decision-making, their inability to understand that he'd found something valuable in a relationship they saw only as scandalous and inappropriate. Mia shared the practical details of her life since being fired, the job applications and rejections, the way the story had spread through social media to affect Sophia at school, the isolation that came from being recognizable as someone associated with controversy. She talked about the catering work and the interviews, where managers looked at her with suspicion, wondering if hiring her would bring unwanted attention to their businesses. But more than the logistics of survival, she talked about the deeper wound, the way being punished for kindness had made her question her instincts, wonder if the empathy that had always been her strength was actually a liability in a world that seemed to reward cruelty and indifference. "I keep thinking about that morning when you first told me about your children," she said. "You were in so much pain, and it felt like the most natural thing in the world to comfort you. I didn't think about class differences or what people would say, or whether it was appropriate. I just saw someone hurting." "That's exactly why I needed to know you," James replied. "In my world, everything is calculated. Every relationship serves a purpose. Every conversation has an agenda. But with you, it was just human, real in a way I'd forgotten was possible. Real enough to cost me everything I'd worked for." The words hung between them, honest and brutal, and impossible to soften with explanations or apologies. James had rediscovered his humanity through their connection, but Mia had lost her livelihood and her sense of safety in the world. The exchange was fundamentally unequal. Another reminder of how differently consequences fell on people with different amounts of power and protection. "I want to help," he said finally. "I know I can't undo what happened, but I want to try to make it right somehow. I could—" "What? Give me money?" Her voice was sharp with the pride that had kept her working double shifts instead of accepting charity, the dignity that had made her a target in the first place. "Pay me off so you can feel better about what happened?" "No, that's not what I meant." But he realized he didn't know what he meant, didn't have a clear plan beyond the desperate need to somehow balance the scales of injustice. "I just know that you're suffering consequences for something that was as much my fault as yours, and I can't stand that." Mia studied his face in the lamplight, seeing the genuine remorse, but also the limitations of someone who'd lived so long with wealth that he'd forgotten there were problems money couldn't solve. Her reputation couldn't be purchased back, her sense of security couldn't be restored with a check, and her trust in the fundamental fairness of the world couldn't be rebuilt with any amount of material compensation. "You want to help?" she said quietly. "Tell the truth, publicly. Not because it will fix anything for me, but because there might be other women out there who need to know that sometimes the problem isn't what they did wrong, but what other people chose to see when they looked at kindness and decided it was threatening." He nodded slowly. Understanding that she was asking for something much more difficult and valuable than money, She was asking him to use his platform and privilege to challenge the same social machinery that had protected him while destroying her. It was a request that would require the courage he'd failed to show when it mattered most, but applied now to prevent other women from suffering similar consequences for similar crimes of basic human decency. As the evening deepened and their conversation wound toward its natural conclusion, they both understood that this reunion wasn't the beginning of a restored relationship, but the end of something that had been broken beyond repair. Too much harm had been done, too much trust had been lost, too many consequences couldn't be undone. But it was also a kind of redemption, not complete, not adequate to balance what had been destroyed, but real enough to matter. James had found the courage to seek her out and take responsibility for his moral failures. Mia had found the strength to forgive without forgetting, to show grace without pretending that grace was sufficient to heal all wounds. When he left her apartment that snowy December evening, they both knew they were saying goodbye to more than just each other. They were letting go of the possibility that had once existed between them, the future they might have built if the world had been different, less rigid, more forgiving of connections that crossed the carefully maintained boundaries between economic classes. But they were also closing a chapter with honesty instead of abandonment, with acknowledgement instead of denial, with the recognition that even failed love could teach valuable lessons about courage, dignity, and the price of caring for each other in a society designed to keep people separate and suspicious. It wasn't the reunion either of them had dreamed of during the lonely weeks since their worlds had exploded, but it was real and honest and complete in ways that mattered more than happiness. Sometimes, the best we can do is clean up our messes with integrity and learn to do better the next time we're faced with a choice between love and fear, between comfort and courage. The truth James promised to tell came in the form of an op-ed published in the Chicago Tribune 6 weeks after their reunion, on a Sunday morning when the city was covered in fresh snow and people were drinking coffee in restaurants throughout the metropolitan area. The headline was simple: "What I Learned from a Waitress About Courage and Class." Mia read it sitting at her new kitchen table in a small apartment in Logan Square, where she'd moved after finding work at a family-owned Mexican restaurant whose owners cared more about her experience and work ethic than her association with scandal. The job paid less than Murphy's had, but her co-workers treated her with respect, and the customers were working families who understood that service was skilled labor deserving of dignity. James's essay was unlike anything typically published on the Tribune's opinion page. Instead of policy arguments or political positions, it was a personal reckoning with privilege, an examination of how wealth could insulate people from the consequences of their moral choices while amplifying those consequences for anyone with less protection. He wrote about their friendship with honesty that made Mia's throat tighten with recognition, the loneliness that had driven him to seek connection outside his usual social circle, the genuine warmth and intelligence he'd discovered in someone his world had trained him to see as invisible, the way her kindness had reminded him of his own capacity for vulnerability and growth. But more importantly, he wrote about his failure when that friendship was threatened by social pressure and business concerns. He detailed the conversation with Jonathan Wesley, the way his children had pressured him to end the relationship, the choice he'd made to protect his reputation at Mia's expense. He was particularly blunt about the consequences of that choice, how his withdrawal had left her exposed to media scrutiny and gossip while he remained safely insulated by wealth and social position. "I learned too late that courage isn't something you can purchase," he wrote in the essay's conclusion. "It's something you either practice or lose, and I lost mine when someone I cared about needed me to be brave enough to tell the truth about our friendship. Mia Rodriguez showed me kindness when I was drowning in success that felt meaningless, and I repaid that kindness by abandoning her when kindness became inconvenient for my social standing. She lost her job for treating me with basic human dignity, while I kept my wealth and status by pretending that dignity was inappropriate when it crossed class lines. If we want to live in a society where working people are treated with respect, those of us with power need to practice that respect Even when it costs us something, especially when it costs us something. The response was immediate and intense. James's phone rang constantly with calls from board members, business associates, and social acquaintances who were either furious at his public admission of moral failure or concerned about the implications for their own reputations. His revelation that wealthy people regularly abandon personal relationships to maintain business standing made other powerful individuals uncomfortable, forcing them to examine their own choices and finding themselves wanting. But there were other responses too. Letters from working women who shared their own stories of being punished for treating wealthy customers with too much familiarity, fired for being friendly rather than appropriately subservient. Messages from service workers who thanked him for acknowledging that their labor was skilled and their dignity mattered. Comments from people who'd followed the original scandal and were grateful to finally understand what had actually happened between the billionaire and the waitress. Sophia called her mother after reading the essay online, her voice thick with emotion. "Mom, did you see it? Did you see what he wrote?" "I saw it, baby." "Are you okay? I mean, having it all laid out like that, everything you went through?" Mia was quiet for a moment, watching the snow fall outside her window and thinking about forgiveness, redemption, and the complex mathematics of making amends for harm that couldn't be undone. "I'm proud of him for writing it. It took courage to be that honest about his failures, especially knowing it would cost him professionally." "Do you think you'll ever talk to him again?" "I don't know. Maybe someday. But that's not why he wrote it, and it's not why I'm glad he did. He wrote it because other people needed to hear that story, needed to understand that these situations are usually more complicated than they look from the outside." The essay didn't restore Mia's job at Murphy's or undo the weeks of unemployment and financial stress she'd endured. It didn't eliminate the social media commentary that had made Sophia's college experience more difficult. Didn't return the sense of security that came from 8 years of steady employment at a place where she'd been valued and respected. But it did something else, something harder to quantify but equally important. It shifted the narrative from one in which a waitress had somehow transgressed appropriate boundaries with a wealthy customer, to one in which a lonely man had found genuine friendship with a woman whose kindness had been punished by a society too rigid to tolerate authentic connection across class lines. More broadly, it contributed to conversations happening in workplaces throughout Chicago and beyond about the treatment of service workers, about the difference between friendliness required for tips and genuine human connection, about the responsibility of customers to treat the people serving them with basic respect, regardless of social or economic differences. Harold Murphy called her 3 days after the essay was published. She was surprised to hear from her former boss and initially wary about his motivations for reaching out. "I read what that man wrote about you," he said without preamble, "about what really happened between you two, about why you lost your job. It doesn't change anything, Harold. You did what you thought you had to do to protect your business. Maybe, but I also did what was easy instead of what was right. And after reading his side of things, after thinking about the 8 years you worked for me without a single complaint or problem," he paused and she could hear the regret in his voice. "I want to offer you your job back. If you want it. Same schedule, same pay, with a raise to make up for the weeks you were out of work." Mia was quiet for so long that Harold wondered if the connection had been lost. Finally she spoke, her voice careful and measured. "That's a generous offer, and I appreciate it more than you know, but I don't think I can come back. Because of how I handled things. Because of how everything happened there. Too many memories, too much history. I need to build something new somewhere else." Harold accepted her decision with understanding, but the offer itself meant something important. Acknowledgement that she'd been wronged, recognition that her version of events had been vindicated by James's public confession. It was a small piece of justice in a situation where complete justice was impossible, but small pieces sometimes mattered more than grand gestures. 6 months later, Mia received an unexpected letter from Margaret Cromwell, the Tribune columnist who had written the original gossip item that started the media frenzy. The letter was handwritten, a rarity in their digital age, and brief but genuine in its apology. I wrote about your situation without knowing you, without understanding the complexity of what was actually happening between you and Mr. Donovan, Cromwell wrote. I treated your life as entertainment for my readers, and I failed to consider that my words would have real consequences for a real person. Your dignity throughout this ordeal has been a lesson to me about the harm that casual journalism can cause, and I wanted you to know that I'm sorry for contributing to your suffering. It was another small piece of redemption, another acknowledgement that the machinery of scandal and judgment had operated unjustly in her case. These individual apologies couldn't undo the larger systems that made such injustices possible, but they represented people examining their own roles in perpetuating harm and choosing to take responsibility for their contributions. As winter gave way to spring and then summer, Mia began to rebuild not just her career, but her understanding of what was possible when ordinary people found the courage to treat each other with dignity despite social pressures that encouraged cruelty and indifference. Her story had become larger than her individual experience, a reminder that kindness was always a choice, that crossing class lines required courage from everyone involved, and that the people with the most power had the greatest responsibility to use that power to protect rather than harm those who were more vulnerable. She never did speak to James Donovan again, but she followed his career from a distance and was glad to see that his public honesty about moral failure had led to larger changes in how he conducted both his business and personal relationships. The courage he'd failed to show when it mattered most to her, he seemed to be practicing consistently in other situations where powerful people needed to choose between comfort and integrity. Sometimes the most important lessons came not from success, but from failure, not from getting what we wanted, but from learning how to survive and thrive after losing what we thought we needed. Mia's story was ultimately one of resilience, her own, and that of working women everywhere who continued to show up with grace and professionalism, despite being treated as invisible by a society that depended on their labor but rarely acknowledged their humanity. In the end, she discovered that dignity was something no one could take from her, regardless of what they could take away. And sometimes that knowledge was enough to build a new life on, one small act of courage at a time. 2 years after the scandal that had transformed both their lives, Mia Rodriguez opened her own small cafe in the Pilsen neighborhood, a warm space filled with the scent of fresh coffee and homemade pastries, where the walls were covered with photographs from the community and the tables were always set for conversation. She named it Corazon, which meant heart, because she'd learned that the heart was both the most vulnerable and the strongest part of any human being. The cafe wasn't fancy. Mismatched chairs, a counter built from reclaimed wood, plants hanging in windows that faced the street where children walked to school each morning. But it was hers, purchased with a combination of her savings, a small business loan, and an anonymous donation that had appeared in her bank account exactly 1 year after James Donovan's essay was published. The donation came with no note, no conditions, no expectations of gratitude or recognition, but she knew who had sent it and why. Sophia, now in her senior year at Northwestern with a summa cum laude GPA and early admission to law school, worked at the cafe on weekends and holidays. She'd grown into a young woman who understood that dignity wasn't something you inherited, but something you practiced daily, especially when treating people who had less power than you did. "Remember that woman who called you a gold digger?" Sophia asked one Saturday morning as they prepared for the day's opening, arranging fresh flowers in small vases for each table. "From your economics class? What about her?" "She came in last week, didn't recognize me at first, but when she realized who I was, she got this look, like she wasn't sure if she should leave or pretend she'd never said those things about you." Mia paused in counting the till, curious about how her daughter had handled the encounter. "What did you do?" "I served her coffee and one of your chocolate croissants, and when she tried to apologize, tried to explain that she was young and hadn't understood the whole situation, I told her that the best apology was treating service workers with respect from now on, no matter who they were or what she thought about their circumstances. Pride swelled in Mia's chest, not just for her daughter's grace under pressure, but for the way Sophia had learned to transform past hurt into future wisdom. This was how change happened, not through grand gestures or dramatic confrontations, but through daily choices to see people as complex human beings deserving of dignity regardless of their economic status or social position. The cafe attracted a diverse clientele, professors from the nearby university campuses, construction workers starting early shifts, mothers meeting for coffee while their children played in the small corner she designated as a reading nook, elderly residents who came for the afternoon chess games that had become a neighborhood tradition. But most importantly, it attracted other women who worked in service industries, who recognized in Mia someone who understood the particular challenges of earning a living through labor that was essential but often invisible. Among her regular customers was Elena, a hotel housekeeper who had been fired for accepting a tip that her supervisor claimed was too large, implying she'd done something inappropriate to earn it. There was Carmen, a nursing assistant who'd been let go for spending too much time with elderly patients, accused of being inefficient when she was actually being compassionate. And Maria, a waitress who'd lost her job for politely correcting a customer who'd made racist comments about the food she was serving. Each of these women had learned the same lesson Mia had, that kindness could be dangerous when it was offered by people with less power to people who had more, that compassion could be twisted into evidence of impropriety or poor judgment, that the very qualities that made someone good at care work could make them vulnerable to exploitation and punishment. But at Corazon, these women found something different, a space where their experiences were understood, where their dignity was assumed rather than questioned, where their stories were treated as valuable rather than entertaining. Mia had created not just a business, but a small sanctuary where working women could be seen as complete human beings rather than reduced to their job titles or their mistakes. James Donovan never visited the cafe, though he'd driven by it several times over the past year. Not because he was avoiding Mia, but because he understood that her new life was separate from their shared history, that his presence would inevitably attract attention and speculation that could harm what she'd built through her own courage and determination. Instead, he supported her business indirectly, recommending it to colleagues when they asked about good coffee near the university, mentioning it in interviews when reporters asked about his changed perspective on service workers and small businesses. His essay about their friendship had become required reading in several business ethics courses, and he'd spoken at conferences about the responsibility that came with wealth and social position. More importantly, he'd changed how he conducted his own business relationships, insisting that construction workers and cleaning staff on his properties be treated with the same respect as any other professionals, that their labor be valued fairly, and their humanity be acknowledged consistently. It was a small way of practicing the courage he'd failed to show when Mia needed it most, applied now to prevent other working people from suffering similar consequences for doing their jobs with care and dignity. His children had eventually come to understand, if not fully approve of, his transformation. Emma had visited the cafe once, curious about the woman who had played such a pivotal role in her father's moral evolution. She'd ordered coffee and observed Mia's interactions with customers, the way she remembered names and preferences, asked about family members, offered comfort during difficult times, and recognized that her initial judgment had been both unfair and incomplete. "She's not what I expected," Emma told her father over dinner that weekend. "I mean, she's obviously intelligent and thoughtful, but there's something else. This quality of really seeing people, really listening to them. I can understand why you valued her friendship." "Can you understand why I should have defended it when it mattered?" Emma was quiet for a long moment before answering. "I'm starting to. I think we all got so used to protecting our reputation and status that we forgot those things are supposed to serve us, not the other way around. When you let social pressure end your friendship with her, You were serving the reputation instead of letting it serve your actual values. It was a mature insight from someone who'd grown up with privilege, but was learning to examine its costs and responsibilities. Emma had started volunteering with an organization that provided legal aid to service workers, particularly women who'd been fired or demoted for reasons that seemed connected to gender or class bias. It was her way of practicing the lessons her father had learned through his failure with Mia, that power came with obligations, that privilege should be used to protect rather than harm people with less protection. On the second anniversary of the day she'd left Murphy's Corner Diner with her belongings in a paper bag, Mia stood in her own cafe, watching the evening light slant through windows she'd cleaned herself that morning. Sophia was at a corner table, studying for her LSATs while occasionally looking up to help customers who came to the counter. The space was filled with the comfortable murmur of conversation, the gentle clatter of dishes being cleared, the soft jazz music that created atmosphere without overwhelming the human voices that were the cafe's true soundtrack. A young woman approached the counter, nervous and obviously interviewing for service jobs based on her carefully chosen clothes and the stack of applications visible in her folder. She ordered coffee and identified herself as someone new to Chicago, looking for work in restaurants or cafes, wondering if Mia might be hiring or might know someone who was. Looking at this young woman, Mia saw herself 15 years earlier, hopeful, hard-working, trying to build a stable life through honest labor, assuming that treating customers with kindness and respect would be appreciated rather than punished. She also saw the potential for future heartbreak, the vulnerability that came with needing employment from people who might not value the humanity of the people serving them. "What's your name?" Mia asked, wiping down the counter while they talked. "Jessica. Jessica Martinez. I just graduated from DePaul with a degree in social work, but I need to work while I look for positions in my field." "Have you worked in restaurants before?" "Some, mostly during college. I know it's hard work, but I don't mind that. I actually like taking care of people, making sure they have what they need." Mia smiled, recognizing the idealism that had once been hers, hoping that Jessica would be able to maintain it without learning the hard lessons that had nearly broken Mia's faith in human decency. But she also knew that young women like Jessica needed more than hope. They needed practical wisdom about navigating workplaces where their kindness might be misinterpreted, their professionalism might be questioned, their dignity might be treated as optional. "Let me give you some advice," Mia said, preparing Jessica's coffee with the same attention she brought to every order. "Be professional, be kind, but remember that your job is to serve coffee and food, not to solve people's emotional problems. Some customers will try to make you their confidant, their therapist, their friend. Be polite, be caring, but maintain boundaries. And if anyone ever makes you feel uncomfortable or unsafe, trust your instincts and get help immediately." Jessica listened intently, recognizing that this advice came from experience, that Mia was sharing hard-won wisdom about surviving and thriving in service work. "Is it really that complicated? I mean, I thought it was just about doing good work and treating customers well." "It should be that simple," Mia replied, handing over the coffee with a smile that carried both warmth and caution. "But sometimes treating people well gets complicated when they mistake kindness for something else, or when other people decide your kindness is inappropriate because of who you are or who you're being kind to. Just remember that your dignity matters as much as theirs, and you never have to sacrifice your self-respect to make someone else comfortable." As Jessica left with her coffee and a business card for another cafe owner who was hiring, Mia reflected on how much she'd learned about the delicate balance between openness and self-protection, between compassion and boundaries, between serving others and preserving yourself. The lessons had been painful, but they'd also been valuable, not just for her own survival, but for her ability to guide other women through similar challenges. Just before closing time, as Mia was tallying the day's receipts and Sophia was stacking chairs on tables, a familiar figure appeared at the windows. Not James, she would have recognized his silhouette immediately, but Carlos, her former co-worker from Murphy's Corner Diner, carrying a small potted plant and wearing the shy smile of someone bearing good news. Carlos! Mia unlocked the door to let him in, surprised and delighted to see her old friend. What are you doing here? I heard about your cafe from one of my neighbors. She said the coffee was almost as good as mine, he said with mock indignation before breaking into a grin. I wanted to see what you'd built and to bring you this. He presented the plant, a small succulent with thick green leaves and tiny white flowers. For luck, and to remind you that beautiful things can grow in difficult soil. They spent an hour catching up, Carlos admiring the space Mia had created and sharing news from the old neighborhood. Murphy's Corner Diner had never recovered its previous atmosphere after the scandal. Customers still came for the food, but the sense of community that had made it special was gone. Harold had hired new staff, but none of them had Mia's gift for making people feel seen and cared for, her ability to transform routine service into genuine hospitality. You know what the real tragedy was? Carlos said as they sat at one of the small tables, drinking coffee Mia had brewed from beans she'd chosen herself. It wasn't just that you lost your job, or that rich man learned some lesson about courage. It was that a place where people felt welcome became just another restaurant. When they drove you out, they destroyed something good that had taken years to build. Mia nodded, understanding that Carlos was talking about more than just Murphy's Corner Diner. He was talking about the broader damage that occurred when society punished people for treating each other with dignity across class lines, when the fear of scandal or controversy prevented the kind of authentic human connections that made communities stronger. But look what you did with it, he continued, gesturing around the cafe where Sophia was now reading at the corner table, surrounded by the soft light and gentle atmosphere her mother had created. You took what they tried to destroy and made it into something even better. This place has the same feeling Murphy's used to have, but it's yours. Nobody can take it away from you. As Carlos prepared to leave, he handed Mia a folded piece of paper. One more thing. That man, James Donovan, he never stopped coming to the neighborhood after everything happened. Once a month, maybe twice. I'd see him driving slowly past the diner, sometimes stopping to look in the windows. Never came inside after you left, but I think he was looking for something he lost there. Why are you telling me this? Because forgiveness isn't something you do once, and then you're finished. It's something you practice, something you choose again and again. And sometimes, the people who hurt us are carrying their own kind of pain, trying to figure out how to do better next time. After Carlos left, Mia stayed in the cafe longer than usual, cleaning tables that were already clean, arranging supplies that were already organized, thinking about forgiveness and redemption and the complex mathematics of making amends for harm that couldn't be undone. Through the windows, she could see the neighborhood she'd chosen for her new life. Working families walking home from jobs, children playing in small front yards, elderly people sitting on stoops and sharing gossip and wisdom in Spanish and English and the universal language of community care. This was the world she'd built after losing the one that had been taken from her. Not perfect, not protected from all possible harm, but chosen consciously and created deliberately as a space where dignity was assumed rather than earned, where kindness was encouraged rather than punished, where the simple act of serving others with respect was recognized as both skilled labor and moral practice. Sophia looked up from her textbook as her mother turned off the lights and locked the door behind them. "Good day?" "Good day," Mia replied, thinking about Jessica Martinez and her hopeful anxiety, about Carlos and his wisdom about forgiveness, about the dozens of customers who had chosen to spend their money and time in a space where they felt valued and seen. Hard sometimes, but good. They walked together toward the L station, past murals that celebrated the neighborhood's history and strength, past small businesses owned by families who had built lives through patient determination and mutual support. The evening air carried the scent of dinners being prepared in apartments above shops, the sound of music from open windows, the comfortable chaos of people living their lives with as much dignity and grace as they could manage. In the distance, the lights of downtown Chicago glittered like promises and warnings, reminding everyone in neighborhoods like Pilsen that wealth and power existed in spaces they might never access, making decisions that affected their lives in ways they might never fully understand. But here, on streets where people knew each other's names and stories, where children played freely and elderly people were respected for their wisdom, different kinds of wealth were being accumulated. Wealth measured in friendship and mutual aid, in the knowledge that dignity was something you could practice regardless of your bank account, in the understanding that treating each other with kindness was both the most simple and the most radical thing humans could do. Mia had learned that scandal could destroy a life, but it couldn't destroy a person's capacity for rebuilding with wisdom and courage. She discovered that losing everything she thought she needed had taught her what she actually needed: respect for her own dignity, work that aligned with her values, relationships built on mutual care rather than mutual benefit, and the knowledge that she could survive whatever consequences came from treating other people as if their humanity mattered as much as her own. As the train carried them home through neighborhoods that were transforming and being transformed by the people who chose to build lives there, Mia reflected on the strange mathematics of loss and recovery, the way suffering could become wisdom if you were willing to learn from it rather than simply endure it. Her story wasn't finished, none of their stories were, but this chapter had ended with dignity intact, lessons learned, and the kind of quiet strength that came from choosing courage over comfort, love over fear, connection over the safety of keeping everyone at arm's length. Sometimes that was enough. Sometimes it was more than enough. Sometimes it was everything that mattered in a world that often forgot that the people serving coffee and clearing tables and caring for others in 1,000 invisible ways were human beings carrying their own dreams and fears and capacity for both suffering and joy. And you? Have you ever cared for someone who later forgot you, or held a broken heart without expecting anything in return? Have you ever been punished for showing kindness to someone the world decided you shouldn't treat with dignity? Have you ever discovered that your capacity for compassion was both your greatest strength and your most dangerous vulnerability? If this story stirred something within you, please share your own story in the comments. Let us know about the times you chose kindness despite the risk, the moments when you treated someone with respect, even when society suggested they didn't deserve it, the ways you've rebuilt your life after discovering that doing the right thing sometimes comes with consequences you never anticipated. Leave a like and subscribe so this message of hope and human dignity can reach others who need to know that their stories matter, that their kindness has value, that their dignity is worth protecting even when the world seems determined to take it away. For more stories that honor the strength and grace of working people, click the podcast link on the left. Thank you for taking this emotional journey with us, for listening with your heart, for remembering that behind every service interaction is a complete human being deserving of respect and recognition. Until next time, remember that real strength is in vulnerability, that authentic wealth is measured in relationships and dignity, and sometimes love finds us when we least expect it, teaches us what we most need to learn, and leaves us better equipped to build lives worth living. Your story matters, your kindness matters, your dignity is not negotiable, and neither is anyone else's.